One thing which advertising does do pretty well, although arguably there's scope for improvement as well, is improving our society, improving the world in which we live in. And I'd like you to welcome up our next speaker, who is Abigail Jones, and she will be talking about the social contribution, particularly in this sense in the vaccines campaign. Please welcome Abigail Jones, Strategic Advisor to the DG of the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations, and Brian Coane, Partner at the Leith Agency. Thank you so much.
All right, so he's in charge of the buttons.
I'll click.
So my name should actually really be Abigail Janssen, since Kenny was talking about vibes. I'm Belgian. Okay. Doesn't look it, I know. Ik praat Français couramment, ik spreek Nederlands ook. Ik woon tussen Brussel en Genève, dus I live between Brussels and Geneva. But I will skip the rest of the language tour de force. I think you'll be much happier with me sticking to my BBC World Service English, because that's where I learnt it. So apologies for not having a wonderful Scottish accent. IFPMA, you can work out that we don't sell hot cakes. We're actually the equivalent of the International Advertising Association. So we have 90 of the big pharma brands and the big and smaller associations around the world who pay us dues in Geneva to be the body that represents the innovative pharma industry to the UN. So that's my day job, is fighting off madness from the World Health Organization, which links in with a discussion on alcohol, because unbeknownst to me, we were both working on the same thing in 2006, which is the World Health Organization was passing an alcohol reduction of harmful use of alcohol strategy, and they wanted to ban advertising and bump up tax and whatever. And I represented 16 of the largest alcohol producers. So, and that's the kind of lobbying work that we do. Lots of people mentioned COVID. So here we are talking about COVID. And what did we do when COVID came around? But obviously for us, in what we do, it's part of a broader reflection about what's the value of vaccines. And the issue being that vaccines in our industry had, frankly, prior to COVID, become so ubiquitous that everybody kind of just took them for granted. Apart from obviously the MMR sort of business would go on or whatever. However, vaccine hesitancy has been around for a long time, but in different forms. But let's not forget, in my world, in my global health world, vaccines save lives. I mean, they really, really do save lives. They are actually one of the most effective modern inventions to reduce deaths since 2000. A public-private partnership, so collaboration, industry coming together with intergovernmental organizations, created something called the Global Vaccine Alliance. So it's not yesterday that people were doing collaborations. We've been doing it for a hell of a long time. Well, through the agreements, the procurement deals to get vaccines, in particular to treat children, at least 20 million lives have been saved. 20 million lives have been saved. Kids who can go to school, people who don't actually have to pay out-of-pocket treatment, because not everybody has the wonderful NHS that you have in Britain. 60% of the population can face extreme poverty the moment they have to go and either go to the doctor, buy a pill or whatever. So vaccines are hugely important. So talking about the value of vaccines, we can go on to the other things that they do. They improve prospects of life, going to school. They improve productivity. They actually lower costs on healthcare. That's a big debate that we're having nowadays, is what they do in that context. You know, a lot of vaccines are out there. Some are very, very old. You know, smallpox. Edward Jenner back in
1768.
Yeah, and he was already writing about the challenges of hesitation about vaccines back then. But there's a holy grail of vaccines that we haven't still sorted, which is a vaccine against AIDS, for example. We might be on the cusp of something which is vaccines against malaria, which would be great. But so there's still plenty to do. Now, that being said, and that's why, in a sense, WHO, even prior to COVID, started looking at the issue about hesitancy and saying that actually vaccine hesitancy is one of the 10 threats to address, along with rising cancer. That's amongst the other sort of threats that they're looking at. Vaccine hesitancy, we have a tendency of automatically thinking about anti-vaxxers. That's not entirely helpful. In Nigeria, for many years, the religious factions have been using scares around polio to stop people from getting vaccinated against polio. So the religious, cultural, this is more to do with treatments, but the faith healers in South Africa were one of the biggest barriers to providing treatments for AIDS, HIV, for example, in the earlier periods. So, there are lots of things going on that are much more than just let's say a social movement around what we would call anti-vaxxers. And what I would say is that people are obviously they also are hesitant because they don't possibly trust their governments. They also are hesitant because they possibly see a conflict of interest between a company maybe proposing a vaccine, or as the case may be, which when we come to talking about our campaign is one of the issues. People are just frightened of needles, for example. So I think that we shouldn't sort of just be thinking about hesitancy as being a big mass movement on social media that's trying to get us all to believe an anti-vaxxer narrative. But social media does latch on, in particular, to political, ideological, and religious issues to, let's say, amplify their voice around this issue. So it's certainly a really key area. So COVID struck. So thanks to Ipsos for this this graph. And it really is, I mean, what we're going to be talking about mainly is, where that red dot started. And when that red dot started, just for reminding us of recent history, because there's an amnesia that sets in, January 2020, a virus was shared by the Chinese scientists, and that was not a given. There's a law that allows countries to say, this virus or this pathogen is mine, and I don't want to share it. And I actually want to get a dividend on that. So, for example, some of the flu strains we fight against Indonesia that don't want to share their strains, so that we can't then plan which of the vaccines that we need to make, for example, for flu going forward. So, be really grateful that we had that strain shared really super quickly with scientists around the world. Private scientists, public scientists, academia, big labs. And already, on that day, I mean, you can listen to Ugur Shahin, who's the head of BioNTech. At the weekend, he's already looking at this and saying, I got this mRNA thing, well, what am I going to do? Maybe I can do something. I've never made a vaccine before with mRNA, but maybe there's something that can be done. So already in January, something was happening. Quickly fast forward, March, the WHO suddenly then decide that there's everything going around the world, and they suddenly say, this is a pandemic of international concern. They say that on the 11th of March. On the 19th of March, we gather around all the CEOs of Big Pharma, and we say, we need to be on the good side of history this time round. I link back to Gordon Brown and Nelson Mandela. In 2000, the 39 pharma companies decided to sue Nelson Mandela's government because they wanted to override the intellectual property on AIDS HIV treatments because they had a pandemic. They had I was working at the time for companies in Africa. They were employing 7 people in order that one person would maybe survive. That was how bad it was. And the big brand, Big Pharma, didn't want to budge. They didn't accept that they had to either budge on price or they had to do something to make a difference. And actually, at that stage, now, we've seen many CEOs come and go since then, but the CEOs of today, that still deeply marks them. It's also a narrative that the NGOs use repeatedly against us too. But we decided on the 19th of March that we would say all of the things that we were going to do the right thing in relation to this pandemic. And one of the things was, this is not business as usual. We are going to put aside competitiveness, so companies agree to work together with anybody, with Oxford academics, with biotechs, BioNTech, whatever, do whatever it takes to get there. Linked to that also, we had to put our heads together and say, hopefully we'll be finding something. Hopefully it won't take the 4 years that it took to produce an Ebola vaccine. That was the fastest ever production of a vaccine. Generally it takes 10 to 12 years. Hopefully it won't take 4 years. I think if we would have really been very jolly, we wouldn't have been here today. So it's going to happen that there is going to be hopefully at least one vaccine. And when that happens, we need to be ready to explain that these vaccines are safe and these vaccines are effective, because otherwise, all the best will in the world, we won't achieve that. And just World Economic Forum did a survey at the time to just see what the hesitancy level was. South Korea, 80% of the population was hesitant about a vaccine. 80%. Now, those are not the people who are against vaccines. That was a much smaller proportion. That's 5%. In the UK, compared to South Korea's 80%, it was 60%. So more than half of the population were hesitant that the vaccine would be safe or effective. So that's what we were up against. Even if only 50% of those people decided they weren't going to take the vaccine, we wouldn't have gotten to where we want to get to. And then, do you think that they will be effective? Well, some of you might remember a vaccine called Sputnik. When the survey was done, it didn't exist yet. But talk about hesitancy when you don't trust your government. 45% of Russians said that they didn't think they would be effective. In the UK, it was 23%. So, looking at those things actually do help you understand how trust also affects your decision-making. And just to understand the anti-vaxxer situation, 26% of, for example, Russians or South Africans are against vaccines. There's 17% in the UK and a lot of European countries around that same level. So that's just to give you a general sort of situation of kind of where we were at in, let's say, March to May, saying, okay, we're all on our screens, we're all at home in lockdown, just as everybody else was, but we've got to do something about it. And so what happened was the CEOs said, okay, we're not going to do separate things. There's no point, because we don't actually know whose brand is going to be a winner. We're going to have to do this together. We've got these chaps at IFPMA in Geneva. They seem to know what they're talking about. They've never run a global campaign in their lives to save themselves, but never mind. We'll trust them, and we'll give them, for 2 years, we'll give them 1.5 million for a global campaign. Now, that was big money for us. We'd never seen anything like that. So, that was fine. So we then sat down, we wrote a brief. The brief had to be approved by all the CEOs, companies, or whatever. So those of you who, work with clients and understand how you've got to get them around the table and agree, not obvious. But anyway, we got a brief out. we had to go to all of their big agencies, the big agencies they trusted. But we said, listen, there's one agency we actually do also know quite well, and they've worked with the Europeans too, and whatever, and they're in Scotland, called Leith. So Leith was allowed to be on the roster, and I'm very, very glad that they were, because they were selected. And so as of November, we started working together. And in January, we launched. So you can see the compressed timelines. So that's over to you now.
Yeah, so we set 3 different objectives for the campaign. So we wanted to really build confidence in the safety and efficacy. We wanted to equip the healthcare community as a trusted source, and we wanted to positively represent the industry's contribution in developing those vaccines. I think around the confidence in the safety and efficacy, there was a real need to win hearts and minds. So we knew we needed a rational argument, very much based on fact and on science and on testing and rigor. But we really needed an emotional story as well on the things that connected people, about their families, about lives, about the things they missed in the pandemic. With the healthcare community, we wanted to make sure that we were engaging them because we knew that their recommendation was the strongest recommendation for someone to get vaccinated. And then with the pharmaceutical industry, as Abigail had mentioned, there's a sense that big pharma could potentially have had a negative impact on the campaign or a negative impact on the messaging. And so what we wanted to do was, rather than just focus on the organization, was to really focus on the people within the industry, so the people who were working to make the vaccines and tell their stories. So our production approach, working with green room films here in Edinburgh, and this is right in the middle of the pandemic where we had to coordinate remote shooting in the USA, in Colombia, in South Africa, in France, and in Belgium, working against different lockdowns, changing quite literally daily as we were going through the shoot schedule, to tell the stories of the people in the different countries who were working on the vaccines, and just tell their stories. Those women, people whose husbands and sons were working as medics in the front line, people who were missing their families, and really bring that to life in a way that would make it very human and very engaging. And that really became the mantra for our campaign, and for all the work that we did in 2021 in particular, was around telling people that the people who were making the vaccines needed them just as much as everybody else. So you can see the film that we produced, which told that story.
A full lockdown has been announced.
Thought to be at the peak of the pandemic.
Los hospitales están sometidos a enormes presiones.
Les hôpitaux doivent faire face à une énorme pression.
There have been 1 million new infections in the last week alone.
COVID-19 has been so tough, nonstop. The stress has really got to me at times.
I know I'm lucky to have a job, but working from home day and night while raising 2 kids has been crazy.
My mom is 91. She's normally full of energy, and I've seen her really struggle with isolation.
My husband and son are doctors in a hospital. Every day they are at risk. Sometimes I cry at night with a worry.
It's been very hard. My best friend lost her father.
You try and stay positive, but I worry that my kids are unhappy and miss their friends.
The world really needs COVID-19 vaccines.
We need them to be as safe as other vaccines.
They need to have been independently checked again and again.
We have to help make sure anyone who needs them can get them.
And that's what I've been doing.
What I've been doing because I want to help people get back to normal.
What I have been doing because frontline workers like my husband and son really need them.
What I have been doing because we've suffered enough loss.
What I've been doing to help protect those most at risk. We're just some of the people
who have worked around the clock
on COVID-19 vaccines.
And we need them to be safe for our families.
And for yours.
Just a couple of words on stakeholders. Yeah.
Okay. We also produced a more rational strand to the campaign called 19 Things to Know, which told you 19 things about the vaccines, but particularly once vaccines became more available, it allowed us to pick off particular messages in particular countries where we knew people had objections or where we knew that there was particular issues, and that ran later on that year. Let's pick up quickly on stakeholders, Abigail.
Yes, because I mean we're here talking about to the advertising industry. You're most likely scratching your heads how much advertising to be used on this, and we agreed that we'd say in the first year the budget was around £650,000, and about 150,000 was on advertising. LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Partly because those are the medium that our industry work with, and it's also the medium that the global health community works with. So again, you have to remember, I'm sitting behind my box, but I'm in Geneva in various forms of way, and our world and our need was to make sure that we filled the space in the narrative as the people who were trying to develop the vaccines and produce them at scale. Produced the first vaccine in 326 days, produced 11 billion vaccines in the first year, when actually, up until then, there had only ever been 3 to 5 billion vaccines of all vaccines, including flu, ever produced. So a Herculean task. And our issue was to work with the multiplier effect of global stakeholders. But then it was a white label campaign that all of our companies and all of the associations in the countries could run with in multiple languages. So we had to make sure that the World Health Organization was comfortable with what we were doing and was supporting it. We had to make sure that UNICEF were. And for example, we had to make sure that the Pope was, because embryo was used to do some of the R&D around the vaccines, and the Catholic community were wondering whether this was the right thing to do. And the Pope actually wrote a dispensation saying, yes, it was the right thing to do. So, that's our global stakeholder. And so a lot of our messaging and a lot of our credibility had to come from working through those organizations and doing it. And therefore, the advertising was actually a very small section thereof.
Okay. Should we go on to the...
We'll just skip that because, I mean, we're just saying, obviously, we're continuing on that, and you saw where the big campaign began. You heard we had money for doing campaign over 2 years. So then we went on the sort of kind of building on the narrative of being able to show the effectiveness of COVID vaccines. We wanted to try and keep the conversation going around the effectiveness of vaccines to tackle other global health issues. But we'll skip that in the interest of time.
Yeah, so at this stage, what we wanted to do was really talk more about vaccines across the life course. So it was almost, if you imagine, this was a time picture at the end of the year, here's the year, to really build on that opportunity and talk about vaccines all across life. And so the campaign the following year was focused on keeping that conversation going and talking about how vaccines do the things that you never have to see or protect us from the things that you never have to see. So we can have a quick look at the film for that one now.
Vaccines are the memories our kids won't miss out on. And the sick days we don't need to take. Vaccines are the hospital beds that won't need to be made. The ventilators that won't need to be turned on. The get well soons we might not receive. And the sorries we won't have to say. Vaccines are a future where people might not have to hear it's cancer. Where parents might not have to see their children suffer with malaria or paralyzed by polio. We've seen that vaccines can do amazing things. But even more incredible is what we may never have to see.
So I guess we set out 3 objectives. One was to get across this whole idea of the efficacy and effectiveness of the vaccines. And so we ran with Facebook, a Facebook Leith study, which I won't go into the detail, but you can see really we focused on social norms, safety and importance, and we managed to get positive impact, particularly around social norms in the first phase of the campaign. And then into the second phase, when we're more focused on rational messages, again, the Facebook Lift study showed the impact that the campaign had had quite successfully in moving the figures there too. I guess the other element was really just around, as Abigail been talking, the engagement and being able to get lots of people involved. So we had a massive adoption from the IFPMA member companies and associations, and also amplified by global stakeholders. And then just in terms of the actual delivery from the campaign, a high number of impressions and lots of engagements. Overall,
Can I just quickly do that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So we track, of course, reputation of pharma industry. It's the campaign, obviously, in itself, a drop in the ocean in the general debate. But I think it's just interesting seeing that, despite what often the politicians and the NGOs say, the general public, on the whole, have a fairly high level compared to other industries of trust. And we also did looking at trust, for example, of biopharmaceutical chief executives, and they scored higher, for example, than the government and media. So that's sort of kind of our world. And I think the other thing just to raise is throughout this whole period of COVID, obviously we had the Global Digital Campaign, but we were also in the eye of the storm of the media. One week, I think we did 25 live interviews with media from around the world. And the first year we actually got 9 billion media impressions. So, this is part of what has contributed to those figures.
So just really concluding, I guess, what we can learn from the case study. I think it's interesting in terms of this sense of a team approach and all the different stakeholders and players that were involved in it, and bringing different voices from those different stakeholders to communicate the messages was really critical. I think the other part of it is just realizing how politicized that vaccines have become, and we saw lots of issues around things like masks, and where different people viewed the mask as being an imposition depending on your political persuasion. So I guess there's a little bit of an appeal there in the sense of we all have a role to play in communicating vaccine confidence or communicating around vaccines in an appropriate way. And I suppose really just kind of finishing on that, it would be remiss of me not to say that now's a really good time to get your COVID or flu vaccine if you're due for it, and don't let your protection fade. Thank you very much.